Thank you. Well, colleagues and friends, it's an honour and privilege for me to be asked to chair this afternoon session in this wonderful conference. I'm a trustee of the musical brain or musical mind, and for me as an academic psychiatrist and a singer, sort of holding these two things together has always been pretty central to what one's view of both medicine and one's view of music and song. And the session this morning I thought was really interesting. The thoughts going through my mind is very briefly were the role of popular song, in World War II and World War I, and themes of homesickness and attachment issues, and the whole cultural element in this field. So I'm listed as a speaker. I'm not a speaker. My main task is to introduce two very special people making formal presentations. And our first is Ben Shephard, a medical historian and military historian, to inform us about shell shock, which is very much linked to some of the key early years of psychiatry.
Thank you. In the billing for this, I rather injudiciously referred to drawing on the rich literature of shell shock. It is indeed extraordinarily rich, but there isn't time to do more than cover the basics today, I think. Shell shock is a curious thing. If you'd written about the First World War 40 years ago, you wouldn't have mentioned shell shock at all. And it's come back into consciousness because of several things: Vietnam, feminism, the invention of post-traumatic stress disorder in 1980, and it's particularly been associated with two wonderful books, Paul Fussell's book about the First World War, Pat Barker's Restoration Trilogy. What was shell shock? How does it relate to modern PTSD? The term shell shock was coined in February 1915 by the Cambridge psychiatrist Charles Myers, who was then working at the Duchess of Westminster's rather loony hospital in the casino at Le Touquet in France. And it was based on 3 soldiers he had seen who had all been under shell fire. And shell shock, you should understand, was a portmanteau term. It was an overall term which covered at least 4 different conditions. Firstly, soldiers who had been shelled, had no lesions, yet were nonetheless shaken and needed time to recover. Secondly, men worn down by the strain of trench warfare, obviously more common later in the war. Thirdly, men traumatized by the horrors they'd seen, men with their heads blown off, etc. And fourthly, people immobilized by fear. And shell shock, when it first appeared, presented a sort of mystery to the medical establishment, which is best expressed by what the Pope of Anglo-American medicine, Sir William Osler, said in a postcard, July 1915, "I cannot imagine what has got into the central nervous system of the men: hysterical dumbness, deafness, blindness, anesthesias galore. I suppose it was the shock and the strain, but I wonder if it was ever thus in previous wars." And actually, Simon Wesley and Edgar Jones have shown that in the Boer War, comparatively similar cases were reported, but people evacuated back after the disasters at Colenso and Spienkop and so on, but this didn't pass into the kind of medical mainstream. And so this argument began about shell shock. Firstly, was it physical? Was it caused by organic damage to the brain? And there had been these extraordinary developments in artillery since the previous war in the 1870s, European wars. Artillery had begun to use high explosive. It was much more accurate. It was much more quickly repeated. It was impossible now to foresee, to hear coming, as it were. And the physics of concussion, what happens, the physics of what happens when shells explode around you, these were unclear, and indeed they were still unclear in the Second World War when Solly Zuckerman was blowing up goats in quarries in Oxfordshire. And so there were arguments that this was something caused physically, and there were parallels, perhaps Simon may explore this, with what is now known as traumatic brain injury. Now, the shell shock affected people in different contexts. Obviously, it affected the individual soldier, but it also raised questions of military medicine and had implications for discipline and wastage of manpower. And it also, of course, affected the doctors who were trying to understand it and doctors trying to treat it. This presentation is roughly chronological, and therefore I'm afraid it rather ducks and weaves between these different things. Thematically, it's a mess. The military context. Bear in mind, in the First World War, there was no proper selection of personnel. Even by the end of the war, there wasn't proper selection of personnel. Loads of people were in the army who shouldn't have been there. Why are there no war poets in the Second World War in quite the same way? Because they're in RAF public relations. Then we get to this very important question of the role of public opinion at home. Shell shock was taken up by the newspapers and in Parliament. It was respectable. Officers got it. Lord Northcliffe's brother donated his house as a hospital for officers in early 1915. And we get into this very tricky and difficult area which hasn't been researched, which is the role of public opinion. And all we have to go on here are what doctors said after the war. And they said things like, 2 years of vigorous journalism in the home press had prepared the recruits to become cases of shell shock. They said things like, the term shell shock had become a generally recognized term as if it were a new disease. Misguided public opinion had raised the psychoneuroses to the dignity of a new war disease before which doctors seemed well-nigh helpless. This view became rapidly widespread among the soldiers in France. So there's a kind of feedback loop operating here, and one aspect of this was that the army at home, the War Office, bowed to civilian pressure and for the first time accepted there was this grey area between being wounded, being mad, being fine, and being a coward who should be shot. And they accepted the notion of commotional shell shock wounded, but they didn't accept emotional shell shock because they were worried about the effects of discipline. On discipline. And one of the things we all know about is that of the 332 soldiers who were executed during the war, some had shell shock. Nobody knows quite how many, nor do we know about the 9/10 who were let off, whether they were let off for shell shock. We don't know that. But shell shock officially, in the cases which survived, wasn't accepted as a defense until 1918, and Sir Douglas Haig famously said, how can we ever win, i.e. win the war, if this plea is allowed in a shell shock case? Okay, now I'm going back to the medical arguments. And by 1916, it had become clear, evidence was emerging, and it had become clear that the wounded didn't get shell shock, prisoners of war didn't get shell shock. Simon Wesley doesn't agree, but he's a pedant. The literature in the First World War basically said. So, and also, some people didn't get it. Some people got shell shock without actually leaving England, right? So the argument went, by the end of 1916, people are saying, it's psychological. And if it is psychological, is it perhaps, they now said, a variant of the two nervous disorders recognized by medicine before the war, namely hysteria and neurasthenia, or nervous exhaustion? And there was perceived to be a difference in symptoms, which, put crudely, was that the men got hysteria and the officers got neurasthenia. And the rationale of this is that the men escaped into their symptoms. They used these symptoms, they developed these symptoms to escape from this horrible situation they were in. Officers, it was more complicated because their sense of social responsibility, their sense of social position, their sense of obligation and duty to their men forced them to stay, and therefore they had this mental conflict which resolved itself in the symptoms of neurasthenia. Now, some modern scholars have poured scorn on this. I personally would rather believe Sir Henry Head, a rather distinguished neurologist of this epoch, than somebody at the Wellcome who's 25, but I leave it to you. Now, frontline treatment. After 1916, the British followed the example of the French. They stopped sending shell shock people back to England, and they introduced treatment near the front line based on principles which in the 1950s became known as PI, proximity, immediacy, expectancy. Basically, if you treat people near the front line, you can still draw on loyalty to their comrades, etc., and you have a better chance of getting them back into the front line. And by this stage, they developed quite quick tricks for removing symptoms. Deafness, you just bang two books together and people started up. The other favorite was to say, in half an hour, we'll give you electricity. And it was observed that after 29 minutes, people's symptoms had a habit of going away. Also important in this context was reimposing discipline, military discipline.